Welcome to the CryptoCounsel at Wiley, where we decode the most important issues in crypto litigation and regulation. I'm Frank, a finance and technology litigator who focuses on crypto law.
And I'm Isaac, a white-collar litigation attorney who focuses on government-adjacent litigation and crypto issues.
And Lauren is sitting this one out, but we have a third person with us, our guest, Tim Hite. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you.
And
it's good to be here.
We really appreciate it. So, and you braved it's sort of broken, but the DC heat of this week's heat wave. We came all the way to our office in our podcast studio. So
it's a chilly 70 degrees now.
It was a little disorienting. I was sort of like, what happened?
It's also a Friday, you know, so we really appreciate you coming out, with the work. I'm sure you could be working from home right now.
These are all true things.
Happy to.
So, Tim, obviously we have gotten to know you and what you do and where you do it and how you fit into the crypto world, but our listeners have not yet gotten to hear your story. So you want to just tell folks how you came into crypto, what you do, and a little bit about yourself.
Name's Tim Hite. For the last 4 years, up until this January, I worked in the House of Representatives. For the first 2 years, I was financial services counsel to Congressman Warren Davidson from Ohio. And then for the last 2 years, I was a counsel on the House Financial Services Committee under Chairman Patrick McHenry. Specifically, I was on the Digital Asset Subcommittee, which was chaired by now Chairman French Hill from Arkansas. And I guess right before that, I was at FINRA for a few years. That was right out of law school. So, I got to see a lot in 4 years on Capitol Hill with the development of crypto policy, and happy to share a little bit about that story.
And before we get into that story, which I'm really excited to talk to you about, you have since left the Hill and are now at a private company, right?
Yep. And now I'm policy director at Exodus. We're a non-custodial software wallet with over 2 million users here in the U.S., publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange based out of Nebraska.
Awesome. And before we get to the story, part two, I actually didn't know the FINRA piece about your background. Did you do it? Had FINRA and crypto been a thing at that time?
No, I got into crypto during law school, actually. The 2017 market, the bull run there at the end of the year, that's kind of where I grasped on. I made a lot of paper gains, lost them all, and I learned a lot in the process. So,
did they have a crypto class while you were in law school, or was that not even a thing yet?
So I don't know if you know J.W. Verrett. He teaches over at George Mason, which was where I went, and he's big in the crypto space. If there was a class, he would have taught it. I unfortunately never took any, but it was touched upon in the securities classes and the banking classes because, at that time, I think that market was probably $500 billion at the time or so. So, it caught some people's eyes, and this was before there was really any conversation about legislation or anything like that. So it's come a long way in only 8 years.
Yeah, and like a lot of subjects in law school nowadays, you basically rip up the textbook that existed for decades and start anew, or just kind of look at the teacher. The teacher looks at you and you say, I don't know. So interesting time to be a young lawyer.
The exam will be multiple choice this semester.
So now finally getting to the story, Tim. I mean, you have definitely had a very unique perspective on the legislative developments for sure. And I guess maybe let's start on the earlier part of it, maybe 2016-ish forward. I mean, what was that time like, or how did that connect up to when you got pretty active in that space?
From a regulatory perspective, there wasn't much that was put out there. I think actually it goes back to 2013. FinCEN put out some guidance that, it basically looked at if you had control of funds, if that would essentially make you a money transmitter. FinCEN eventually elaborated more in 2019 with guidance. But in that 2016 to 2018 range, there wasn't much legislation. Actually, when Speaker Boehner retired, Warren Davidson ran for that seat in Ohio, and that's who I eventually worked for. And when Congressman Davidson got into office, he actually held a roundtable. I believe that was September 2018. And I think there was around 50 or so companies or representatives from the industry there. And so he held this roundtable to basically learn about the crypto industry because no one was really picking it up at the time. And that was September. And by December, he ruled out his Token Taxonomy Act, which was one of the first frameworks that was proposed to say, all right, here's what a security is, here's what a commodity is. And there was a few other provisions within that bill, like de minimis tax exemptions, which we still see and a lot of the industry is still supportive of if they want to transact on a routine basis using Bitcoin. For example, they would like to not be taxed on every single transaction if you're going to buy, whether it's a coffee or whatever. So the first dive into the legislative side. And you also had now Majority Whip Tom Emmer from Minnesota. He introduced the Securities Clarity Act, which takes a little bit of a different approach, but kind of gets at that same problem. So with those two bills out there and leadership in Congress wasn't really hitting on this issue yet. The market, there was no catastrophic collapses here in the U.S. Mt. Gox wasn't enough to trigger congressional effort on that front. So those bills kind of floated out there. You heard very few members, Congressman Emmer, Congressman Davidson, Congressman Soto, Gottheimer. There was a few that would talk about crypto throughout those years. And then FinCEN came out with some guidance in 2019. And then at the end of the first Trump administration in December 2020, we saw what's referred to as the unhosted wallet rule, which would force certain money service businesses to file reports with certain transactions that went to unhosted wallets. And that's where it kind of picked up a little bit in terms of conversation on Capitol Hill. And then in January 2021, that's actually when I went from FINRA to the Hill. So it's kind of where I dove a little deeper into the subject matter from a policy perspective. And fortunately, it was, catching up at that time wasn't too bad. Now, if you were to dive in, there's a lot to catch up on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you joined in that 2021 time period, what was the driving force behind the energy on the Hill to get this legislation? Like, what were people saying? Was it to grow the industry, to create leadership?
The bull market really drove the narrative, right? So because there was a bull market, you saw that was when FTX, you saw substantial growth. Sam Bankman-Fried was involved in the 2020 election. And I think that caught a few people's attention. So in 2021, you're coming out of COVID. I remember going to the Bitcoin conference in Miami. It's, the euphoria is off the charts. And you have these projects that are, looking to capital raise and get off the ground. And you have these VCs that are looking to invest. And at the time, ironically, and some people may forget, but President Biden nominated Gary Gensler to be the chair of the SEC. And he taught on the subject of cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology when he was at MIT. So there was a fair amount of excitement at that time. Looking back, that's a lifetime ago, but people thought there'd be, all right, we're going to get regulatory clarity. If we don't get it at the congressional front with legislation, we're at least going to get some good clarity where projects are going to be able to develop here in the U.S. And obviously, that kind of went the other way with the enforcement actions against some of the exchanges and the intermediaries. And in 2021, I'm trying to think of the timeline now, we saw the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. And that was the first spark that really pushed Congress to do something. And in the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, there was a provision. It was the broker reporting requirement, which would have categorized some crypto service providers as brokers, including unhosted wallets, for example. So for tax reporting purposes, they would have to file with the IRS the trades that their users would conduct. And that was the first time you saw a lot of chatter on Twitter. You saw the trade associations in DC. You saw mainstream coverage, and there was a strong push that ultimately failed, but there was a strong push to address that language in IIJA. And then you had December 2021 where some CEOs testified at the House Financial Services on market structure, and there was just an obvious need that there needed to be clarity for crypto assets, from tax to market structure to stablecoins. So that's when they really picked up the conversation. And then fast forward to 2022, you had Terra Luna collapse, and that was, I would want to say May or June. And that's what kicked off the stablecoin conversation. And that's, to this day, that's sort of why we have a bifurcated product in terms of stablecoin legislation and market structure legislation. So throughout 2022, that's when then Chairman Patrick McHenry and Chairwoman Maxine Waters and then Ranking Member McHenry started working on stablecoin legislation and trying to determine who the federal regulator would be, what eligible assets would be allowed to back these stablecoins, and what BSA provisions there would be. And those conversations, I mean, we're still talking about stablecoins or stablecoin legislation, especially this week with the announcement that they want the Genius Act to be passed within the next month. So, but that's really where it started. And then I guess just following the calendar, you fast forward into towards the end of 2022, you have the midterm elections, and that was the week FTX blew up.
Right.
And then you have market structure take off. So that's to this day, that's why you have two different workflows.
I'm trying to remember, was it in 2022, was it that Super Bowl where you had the ads, the big crypto ads that caught everyone's attention, and sort of you started to see it in popular press as much as, obviously on the Hill, there's the conversations, but it just felt like it took on a life of its own from that point forward up until the FTX collapse, which you just mentioned. But the trajectory between that point and earlier was it was pretty wild.
It was. The Terra Luna sponsorship of the Nats Park, where the VIP club, the Terra Club, I think it's still the Terra Club, to have that sponsorship established, and then the May 2022 collapse at that time, it was wild. And then the midterms happened, the House flipped, Chairman McHenry took over, and he established the Digital Asset Subcommittee on his chair, and that's when Congressman French Hill was named the subcommittee chair. And so that was the first subcommittee designated to just address fintech, digital assets, and towards the end we touched on AI a little bit. But parallel with that, the House Ag Committee also had its own digital asset subcommittee, and I guess this is a good point to discuss the House Financial Services versus the House Ag Committee and how that's kind of evolved over the years.
Is that because of commodities?
Yep.
And ag has control over the commodities?
Yeah.
Correct? Do I have that right?
So, for a while in the House and in the Senate, and obviously I'm a little skewed towards the House given my time there, you have a little bit of a battle, not just on crypto, on everything. Every committee, wants its jurisdiction, and they plant their flagpole. And to your point, the commodity versus the security, you can't avoid that. So for a while before things really buckled down, there was the House Ag had its view, House Financial Services had its view, but it wasn't in the spotlight as much as it became in the 118th Congress. So that's when both committees established their subcommittees, and they established a very good working relationship, and it doesn't get enough credit. But they moved one big bill, and that's the FIT 21 bill, Financial Innovation Technology for the 21st Century Act. And they moved that jointly through their committees. Both committees had hearings that were between both, or combined joint hearings, I should say. And that's where there was a real effort and many resources dedicated to establishing a line between what falls under the SEC and the securities laws, what falls under the CFTC. And during that time, there's still a stablecoin conversation. You can never forget that is still going on. That is a more bipartisan conversation between Ranking Member Waters and Chairman McHenry, who, given the House flipping, their positions flipped, but that conversation continued. And so you have this going on. And then in the Senate side, you also have a few other, or Senate Ag Committee going back, I guess, skipping back just a little bit before FTX blew up. They rolled out their own proposed framework under Senator Stabenow and Senator Bozeman. And so the 118th Congress is full force ahead. You need market structure. And unfortunately, we're still working towards that today. But it really highlighted just how many problems needed solved. And we saw how many different actors there were in the industry and how many stakeholders. And we heard from everyone. It wasn't just industry stakeholders either. You have traditional finance that's looking to get involved. And they have interest, and there's clearly competing interests between different models and different business models within the crypto industry. So throughout the 118th Congress, we passed out of committee, we passed a Clarity for Payment Stablecoin Act, and we passed FIT 21 out of both the ag and financial services because that had a dual referral. And that was the bill that eventually made it to the floor. And when it passed out of committee, I think it was all Republicans plus 5 or 6 Democrats. And it also had bipartisan support in the House Ag Committee. Hits the floor. And I'll never forget, we were all going around a room guessing how many, what the whip count would be for bipartisan. We knew it would be bipartisan. We thought, I guess 29 Democrats would support it. Someone said 50, and we looked at him like he was crazy. And 71 did. So, that's when we saw just how bipartisan the crypto issues were. And then during all this time, we're seeing actions out of the Biden administration at the regulatory level. The banking regulators were much more cautious. They had non-objection letters that they would want banks to come get before they would service crypto clients. We had enforcement actions at the SEC. So, there's a bit of a competing agenda there between what was going on in Congress and what was going on at the various regulators. And fast forward now, crypto clearly was very influential in the election. I think from the presidential election to the Senate to the House races, they recognized the need to really support candidates that understood and supported a legislative agenda that would facilitate innovation in the U.S. And then after the election, clearly we have seen a lot of those agency actions rescinded, repealed. The SEC established a crypto task force where they've had many different roundtables on different areas discussing whether it's DeFi, whether it's custody issues. They're trying to hit everything under the sun. On the same time, you have Congress still picking up the market structure and the stablecoin agendas with the Genius Act, which yesterday we saw the Senate hold a press conference saying they wanted that passed, and then market structure would be passed in September. Fingers crossed. One thing I do know, agendas are written in pencil, I think.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be the one to we've seen it a lot, and I really do believe they are ambitious enough to get it done. But I feel for the staff because August recess comes and everyone likes to check out and leave DC and go on vacation. But it sounds like staff's going to be working a good bit over August.
So, I mean, are you more optimistic now with this new Congress and these new bills in terms of actually passing into law as opposed to getting as far as they got with the 118th?
Yeah. I think it was very evident right off the bat with some of the executive orders calling for an establishment of a framework, and going back to the IIJA tax reporting provision. The first crypto bill that actually passed was a Congressional Review Act that overturned the IRS's when the IRS finalized that rule in December of 2024.
Yeah, the broker DeFi rule.
The broker dealer rule. That was that kind of set the tone. That was the first thing the industry lobbied on, because technically you have a short window from when a rule is passed to when the CRA has to go through both houses. So that in the executive order, the establishment of the crypto task force, the banking regulators rescinding the supervisory non-objection letters. That set the tone, and now we're kind of sitting here looking at these two big pieces of legislation. And there's other things out there, some tax reporting, tax provisions like wash trading and things like that. So it's come a long way, and it didn't happen without some catastrophes along the way. It became clear that capital would flow offshore, and I think that resonated a lot with lawmakers because in many respects, a lot of these developers, a lot of these innovators didn't have a choice. And they said, look, unless we can't build here with the fear of an enforcement action, we can't raise capital here. We saw it. In Europe has MiCA, their framework. We've seen it elsewhere. Singapore is obviously a big hub. So in some respects, the U.S. is playing catch up, but at the same time, I think the U.S. is still at a strategic advantage. Should they pass something, they'll be caught up almost instantaneously.
Yeah, I mean, we had Commissioner Peirce on the podcast the day after the election, and she hit on some of the points you're making about the offshoring and trying to stop that. And one thing that we talked about with her was when the internet boom came around and there was private securities litigation reform through the PSLRA, that was the driving force for that law. And if you look at the legislative history, that's what you see.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same conversation and the same concerns, again, with a new emerging technology where U.S. leadership is you either capture the market or it passes you by, and that capital sets up somewhere else. And MiCA is we've had a guest on who is deeply knowledgeable of MiCA, talked about why it's really working for Europe and giving people a lot of confidence in doing business there. And so it's just interesting that it took not a while, but a little bit of time for people to understand that crypto is no different than every other innovation. If you want to keep the money and the capital and the growth and the leadership, you have to have the right legislation and environment around how it can grow here.
Yeah, and I think to that point, one thing that is worth mentioning, going back to the FinCEN 2019 guidance, which basically said if you're non-custodial, you're not a money transmitter, amongst a few other things. There was a bill introduced also by now Majority Whip Emmer called the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act that would have essentially codified that. And it's actually still out there, and there's a version of it in the Clarity Act that we see in the House right now. It's Section 110. And for as much as the industry is critical of the last 4 years, and everyone, it's well documented, everyone knows everyone's position. One thing that deserves credit is that FinCEN 2019 guidance never was rescinded. So there is a bipartisan track record to say, okay, if you're non-custodial, we recognize that. We're not going to treat you as if you're an intermediary like we have treated financial institutions. And so, there is a glimmer there that there is an agreement on something that's very fundamental to the industry. Hopefully it makes it into law, because everyone knows the law is much stickier than guidance is, because it depends on who's running the agencies. Nothing's for certain, but it's hard to overturn a law. So that right now, for a lot of people, that is actually probably the biggest provision in the Clarity Act. A lot of people get caught up on the separation between commodities, securities, rulemakings between CFTC, SEC. But that short provision there in Section 110 is actually where there has been a lot of resources put towards over the last, I want to say 8 years that bill has been around. Actually, that bill, I think, was around before the 2019 FinCEN guidance. So there's reasons to be optimistic because it's not purely partisan. In fact, it cuts along generational lines when we're talking about lawmaking and how Congress approaches these issues. And this is the closest we've ever been. And we've heard many, many times that the president's adamant that he wants to see crypto legislation to be able to sign into law. And hopefully this conversation will be finished by September, and we'll be talking about the rulemakings, because there's no shortage of that under any framework I've seen. There's going to be plenty of rulemakings on the horizon as well.
Yeah, any predictions there? What some of those rulemakings might look like, or too early to tell?
Yeah, it's too early to tell. It's, clearly the SEC crypto task force is hard at work. It'll be interesting in a world where there may not be legislation. I don't know. I don't want to predict that. I don't want to wish that. But I'm sure we'd see some agency action.
Would you say the industry's optimistic about legislation, or cautiously optimistic, or what's your sense there?
Yeah, I think at least on stablecoins, I believe very optimistic. And then on market structure after yesterday, also very optimistic. The September timeline is aggressive, but what we've seen so far was aggressive. Look at it, going back to the CRA, going back to how fast they got clarity put out, how fast the Senate got Genius put out and put through the Senate. I mean, the Senate's a very resource-intensive process to pass a bill, and it failed once on cloture, and it came back. It's kind of incredible how fast they've been moving. So, sure, I guess, yeah, I could see them doing it by September. I think under normal circumstances, like, man, that's aggressive. But then when you look at this year as a whole so far, it's like, well, everything's been aggressive.
How much do you think the fate of the stablecoin bill and the market structure bill are intertwined?
We've heard that as soon as the Genius bill or Genius Act got passed out of the Senate, we heard many in the House say, all right, we got to attach market structure to it or else you're going to lose momentum.
Yeah, I've heard that for sure.
Yeah, and I think being realistic, the way that would likely play out, okay, say that happens and you have President Trump who put out a statement calling for a clean Genius bill, and if market structure was attached and sent back to the Senate would probably substitute in the market structure for what they want and then pass it back, and it's kind of like this game of ping pong, right? I wouldn't see it getting sent back to the Senate the second time. But it would certainly delay things, and I think the optimism would probably take a shot, or the industry's optimism would probably take a shot a little bit. But it's very clear, I think, that both House and Senate want it, the administration wants it, both parties want it. So, I mean, my prediction, speaking as myself, I think we'll see a clean stablecoin bill go through the House, and we'll see conversations and agreements on market structure moving forward between the House and the Senate. The stablecoins have been there. It's been the low-hanging fruit. It's the win that they could take very easily right now. So, but everyone has an opinion in D.C. If I learned one thing.
Yeah, that's the beauty of running a podcast.
I'm wrong a lot of times, too.
The beauty of running a podcast in a Washington, D.C. law firm. You get a lot of opinions. Yeah. I mean, this is really, really interesting. And obviously, you've lived through just a lot of this. So just hearing it, even in this 25, 30 minutes, it's really cool, and love to do a longer conversation about this at the appropriate time. But
yeah, it's easy. You could ramble on and on for everything. And the stories are crazy. I'll never forget Sam Bankman-Fried was supposed to testify after FTX blew up, and he got arrested that night. He was going to testify the next morning, and everyone was excited. It was going to be virtual, and then you had John Ray, who was the bankruptcy trustee, also testifying, and it was just chaos. I mean, it really was. And there's plenty of those stories out there. Everyone has their own story. Where were they at the height of the whatever crypto explosion you want to pick out now?
Yeah, and to reiterate, I mean, you were on the ground. You're one of the few people dealing with this pretty early on, correct? So it's great having you on here to tell some of those war stories and relay the history for the podcast.
Absolutely. Well, really appreciate you coming on, Tim, and really interesting stuff. A lot of perspective that I had not known or heard before. So
I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
All right. Thanks.